A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth, read by Sarah D.
Chapter 1. I remember the calico sleeping bag and how my body was young and tight against it. It must have been a long time ago and in a different place. The air is quite a different colour here. I don't know when I first began to notice it, but gradually it has crept up on me. The different colour of the air, the different taste of the water. It has a certain saltiness, but no one else has noticed it. I think I must have come from some very sweet place, sweet and lukewarm, and the sky the colour of breath. The calico sleeping bag. I was sleeping there for a special reason. It was exciting. This word exciting flings up in my memory, but the accompanying emotion seems queerly absent. I know I was waiting for some new experience, perhaps to be married. Yes, it was the Virgin's calico. How clear it seems to be growing now. I could feel my coiled plaits bumpy under my neck. What a lot of hair I had. I felt so beautiful. The perfume of the ointment rubbed into my skin mingled with the masculine smell of the rush mat, and the harsh effect twanged in my nostrils. Perspiration ran down salty into the corners of my mouth. It was one of the warmer weeks, but never so warm as it can be here. This place is London, or, yes, England. I always get the two mixed up. You see, it was London where I first woke up, that funny, confused morning. I had been dreaming of the pre-wedding ceremony the day before, the drums, the wooden flutes, and then the lamp dance and the big dark tree lit up in bright blue. I still had flecks of gold dust, which my aunts had spent so much time combing through my hair, when I woke. I sat up immediately and felt my eyes contract in amazement. At first I thought I had been ill and they had moved me to some kind of hospital. Then I thought perhaps I had been married already and was suffering from a loss of memory. But the bed hardly seemed like that of a young bride. There was an ink stain on the crumpled sheet, and an old mauve coverlet had half slid off the bed and was trailing on the threadbare carpet. I was surrounded by that sort of remote feeling which you have in dreams, that things are not to be taken quite seriously, but you can always wake up. I have never quite rid myself of that feeling since. However, my mind was functioning very clearly, and I put my head back to think again about this problem. I immediately saw a long faded curtain by my hand and bounced up on my heels to see if there was a window behind it. There was, but my first relief ebbed suddenly when I saw the view. A smoky brown wall loomed up immediately opposite. Pressing my face up close to the glass and peering down, I saw a broken skylight and a lower roof, and a small courtyard beyond. A yellow fog brooded over the scene, and, having noticed this, I could all at once smell it seeping under the windows. It was so dingy, so unlike the space and freedom I had been used to, that I was certain now I was being held against my will. Instinctively, I ran for the door and was almost jerked off my balance when it opened so easily. A long corridor, dimly lit, with doors at intervals on either side, was relieved only by a big black sideboard, checkered with white squares, which I took to be letters, laid out in heaps. To my right, the corridor turned a corner and ended in a little dark flight of stairs. I was about to take a step forward when I noticed a pair of ugly, thick socks on my feet, and my eyes travelled up to baggy pink pyjamas. Swinging the door back, I discovered a rather pretty blue housecoat on the hook, so slipped my arms into it and padded warily down the corridor. I had been right about the white squares on the sideboard. They were letters. Turning them over hurriedly in my hand, I noted that they were addressed to Cadogan Square, London, England. These last two names seemed oddly familiar. While I tried to place them, my eyes swept along the corridor to the banister of a broad stairway carpeted far more sumptuously than the rest of the corridor. It seemed a very big house. This was borne out by the number of various names on the letters. I noticed amongst them a Duchess and a Lady Blanchard. Then, suddenly, my eyes leapt back from a blue airmail form almost in fright. It bore my own name, Diana Clouston. I turned it over, focusing impatiently on the sender's name and address. Here I drew a blank. Robert Streatley, Matar Road, Wellington, New Zealand. Never heard of him, I mumbled. A jangle of metal sounded behind me, and I jerked round to see a little woman in a tight black frock with a bunch of keys dangling at her waist. She smiled rather foolishly, and immediately her battered face reminded me of an old breadboard we had had since I was a child. "Looking for your mail, dear?" "Yes," I gasped quickly, and waited, not knowing if I should say anything more. "I didn't hear you come down to get any supper last night," the woman went on. "Did you run out of pennies for the gas? I've told you to ask me if you do. We're always up late listening to the wireless." "Thank you. I wasn't hungry last night." The woman shook her head disapprovingly and moved off down the corridor. I watched her out of sight, hypnotized by the keys bouncing on her hip, then ran back to my room, clutching the air letter in my pocket. My first impulse was to tear the letter open immediately, but suddenly a peculiar feeling came upon me. Halfway to the flap, my fingers stopped and trembled, and I froze in this position for some seconds, unable to move. Thoughts came flooding into my mind. Who was I? What had I been up till now in this funny new place? Did I even look the same? Turning slowly, I jumped to see someone staring at me out of the mirror. It was my old familiar face, smooth, mousy hair, and small pointed chin. Hot with relief, I tore at the letter, spread it on the bed, and began to read. "Darling, darling, I love you." I started, laughed, and then went on reading. "Nothing much has been happening lately of interest. I went up to Ardmore with the boys, but it was pretty punk compared to last year. I went on the back of Steve's bike, which is going like a bomb now. Brian deserted Sue at the last minute and came with us. Barry was there, or did I tell you? Does he write to you? Because I'm not jealous anymore. I know you love me. When are you going to get a job? I suppose you're doing a lot of sightseeing in London, but I hope you're not lonely, oceans away from home." I stopped reading. I had remembered immediately why the name London seemed familiar, and the memory had chilled me fearfully. It was the name of an imaginary place my sister and I had invented in our childhood, and had continued to elaborate on until our early teens. I searched hurriedly for details. We had made it a distorted reflection of the world as we knew it, at the same stage of civilization, and made up of entirely the same ingredients, only the quantities of these ingredients varied. But when I tried to think in what way they had varied, I felt my image of the land receding out of my memory. With a sensation of rising panic, I tried furiously to concentrate. I remembered only one thing more. There had been one new factor, which was the root of the difference between the two worlds. What this new factor was, I couldn't decide. All my memories of the imaginary land seemed strangely weak. Thinking about it gave me a feeling of strain and tautness, like when a right-handed person tries to write with his left hand. I gave up trying to concentrate. All at once, the situation struck me with a new force. Was it too fantastic that I had slipped into a complete new world inside my mind? Inside my mind? Surely that would mean I had lost control of my mind. Was insane? My head began to buzz, and I felt my sight fading on the little room and turning inwards towards my confused memory. It was all so absurd. It couldn't be anything but a dream. I gave myself a shake, sighed, and picked up the letter again. My head cleared as I read. From it I gleaned several things. Firstly, I was attached, possibly engaged to someone in New Zealand. Robert mentioned a flat in Wellington, and Nairi, presumably my flatmate. There was no mention of my parents, and I wondered if they were dead. I felt relief more than anything at this. Really, the writing was horrible. I smiled to myself as I glanced at the crooked lines. It was odd how I could summon up no feeling towards this Robert who knew I loved him. He struck no chord whatever in my mind. Perhaps if I saw a photograph. I moved instinctively towards a squat, varnished desk in the corner of the room, but my attention was arrested by a fat kitchen clock whose loud ticking seemed suddenly purposeful. 11 o'clock. I was hungry. The woman in black had mentioned a kitchen, pennies for the gas. I opened the door of a large cupboard in search of food. It was cluttered with underclothes, a hat, a plate, knife and fork, a small saucepan, and a blue plastic beaker. I moved the saucepan aside and came upon some butter labelled margarine, a packet of rye biscuits, a tin of coffee, and a bag of sugar. This was all. The untidiness surprised me almost as much as anything else. I had always kept my belongings in such order, or at least I thought I had. Puzzling over this, I began to fold the underclothes neatly and looked around for somewhere else to stow them. The wardrobe disclosed even clumsier disarray, so I gave up all at once and dumped them back on the floor of the food cupboard. At least I would make the bed. Patting the mauve coverlet into place, I caught sight of a small black handbag lying open on the floor. It contained, among lipsticks and dirty handkerchiefs, a purse of small change. Within a quarter of an hour, I came out into the corridor again, wearing a grey skirt, green jumper, and an enveloping pink coat. There was nobody in sight. Feeling oddly criminal, I walked quietly past the black sideboard and turned the corner to meet a big brown door. It was open, and I felt a sudden urge to run. Outside, I gasped and stared. It had been snowing, although at the time I didn't recognize the phenomenon. I had never been so cold. As I said before, I have also been hot in London, hotter than I had ever known in my old land, Mickhold. Turning the corner of Pont Street, I walked quickly towards Sloane Square. I felt my feet swing in an irregular, jerky way, as if I was on the stage and not quite sure of the stage directions. Every time my dusty suede shoes fell on the hard snow, the cold slapped the underneaths of my feet and propelled me forward. Nervously, I was noting the name of the street I was in and of the square I was approaching. A narrow red bus swished past me and came to a stop. At that exact moment, I was conscious of a sharp pain in my eyes, which made me duck my head into my hands. The pain eased at once, and I glanced quickly at the place names on the back of the bus before pulling myself up onto the platform. "Chelsea," I told the conductor doubtfully. "You're going in the wrong direction, miss." He smirked at another passenger. "Oh, it doesn't matter." "Where do you want then? Piccadilly?" "Yes, please." He shrugged, giving me twopence change with my ticket. Suddenly I felt quite happy. I flopped down and wriggled my stiff feet. Piccadilly, Piccadilly. A funny toy name. I couldn't help feeling happy. I watched the bus route with an excited curiosity, forgetting to note the names of the streets, but staring at the shop windows, the wideness of the streets, and the big gates of Hyde Park. "Piccadilly Circus!" I jumped down and stared about me. I've seen Piccadilly several times since then, and now it seems funny to say that it made no impression on me at all. It was a place. It was the place where I was going to get something to eat. That was all. I noticed a restaurant over the road, but when I crossed and looked at the menu outside, I found it was too expensive for me. Farther along, I came to a coffee bar with old-fashioned green windows and a contemporary interior. "Cappuccino?" I was asked briskly. "Yes, one, please," I agreed, not quite sure what this was. Immediately a thought struck me. What a good thing that in this other world the language common in our country was used. "And a piece of mince tart," I indicated, with a nervous croak in my voice. The waiter edged a slab onto a plate and slapped down a second knife. I tried to look nonchalant while wondering how these people managed to eat with two knives. Suddenly he gave a cry of laughter and snatched up one knife to replace it with a fork. He mumbled something to his mate, and they both turned to me with a look of amusement. Embarrassed, I stumbled quickly to a corner, spilling a froth of coffee in the saucer. Out of my window opposite, I could see 2 soldiers having a shoe shine. Looking at the scene, I was once again conscious of the pain in my head, so sharp that for a moment I thought I was going to retch. A second later, it had passed. Soldiers were a common enough sight in Mickhold, for our young men trained regularly, though there hadn't been a war in my lifetime. But it was at the shoe shiner I found myself staring in a hypnotic manner at the colour of his coat, a shiny, glowing, crackling colour, red. My eyes ached as I stared, and as I continued staring, the ache began to fade a little. I was left instead with an impression of rawness, nakedness, and exciting defencelessness. It reminded me of how one's finger feels after the days-old sticky plaster has been removed from it. I took a deep breath and listened to it shake all the way down. I felt completely different, new, excited, and expectant. The mince pie was very good. I crammed the last bite impatiently into my mouth and raised my eyes again stubbornly to the red-coated shoe shiner. The pain returned, but I went on staring until it seemed to dim and fade to a dull discomfort. Feeling I had achieved something, I tucked my black handbag under my arm, where it already felt at home, and walked confidently out into the cold street. I don't know how long I paraded around the West End in this exalted mood, staring at the challenging red advertisements, the red lips and scarves and shoes milling past me. But I suddenly noticed I was very tired and stumbled into the nearest tube station, which had fascinated me earlier. Here I studied the map in a nightmare fashion until a friendly woman established the fact that I wouldn't need to change for Knightsbridge. "But I want Sloane Street," I protested. "That's right," she nodded. So I stepped trustfully into the carriage. By good luck rather than anything else, I found my way home. I call it home now, and at the time, in the light of my weariness, I welcomed it as such. The big door was shut, and I fished instinctively in my deep pocket for a key. I found one, but was too sleepy to register any relief when it fitted the lock. The warm air in the hall caressed my wind-burnt face, and my eyes felt cold in their sockets. This is all I remember of that first day. Although it wasn't yet evening, I almost fell out of my coat and onto the soft and lumpy bed. I woke again before the morning. The light was still on, and I got up clumsily to turn it off. As my hand lifted to the switch, a flash of fear woke me completely. I turned round slowly, realizing the silence and loneliness of the little room. Clearing my throat loudly, I sat down on the one chair and ran my fingers up and down the arm in 5-finger exercises. I was certainly afraid to go back to bed. As I leant back, there was a crackle, and I pulled out a crushed packet of cigarettes from behind me. They smelt rather strong, but for the sake of something to do, I lit one and went to the mirror, where I drew nonchalant breaths and puffed grey halls of smoke into my sleepy reflection. A series of moods began to parade through my mind. Childish elation, a sophisticated cynicism, followed by a feeling of abandoned recklessness. I pulled the appropriate faces, talking conversationally to my reflection, drawing my hair up into a ponytail, a bun. But at the end, my face crumpled. I felt sick. Water kept rising into my mouth, and to swallow the warm liquid made me shudder, even my elbows. I slid down onto the bed again and curled my knees up. It was so cold. But the pressure of my knees on my stomach made me feel even worse, so I stretched out and tensed myself for the cold to hit me. My fingers fell on a big crumpled handkerchief, and as if the idea had only just been suggested to me, I began to cry feebly, groaning and dribbling the warm saliva out of one side of my mouth. I had never been sick on my own before, that I could remember. Where on earth did I belong? An angry indignation rose suddenly in me. I must belong to someone. Why didn't they come and get me? Had I always lived here? Where were my friends? And I hadn't any money. I had the feeling that if I was sorry enough for myself, something would happen to alter the situation. had a quaint faith in fate. Fate wouldn't let me be alone and miserable if she only knew about it. Fate would have to be told. So I went on informing her for the next half hour into a miserably wet pillow, then fell asleep.